I'm married, turning 40 this year. I've got 2 kids that are just on the verge of becoming preteens. I love like fantasy sports. I'm in this fantasy hockey pool, and my big excitement for today is that my 9-year-old joined us this season, and he actually won the whole pool and defeated my friend who's won like for 8 years. And so I got Steve Dangle to do a roast of him. If you're a sports fan, you might know who Steve Dangle is. And I just watched the video and it was awesome. So can't wait to, when I'm done this call, to share with all my friends. And I'll post it on Facebook in case you want to see it too.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm Kevin Rogers. I'm pastor at New Song Church in Windsor. And it's a church that I planted and we just celebrated our 27th anniversary as a church. So a bit about me. I'm a musician. I'm always scouring Kijiji looking for good deals. And so yesterday I traded an acoustic I had for Dan Electro, Dano Pro guitar, and also a mandolin I traded for a pedal that I had. So always looking for deals. Love Jesus, love my family who all live here in Windsor. We have 2 grandsons, and 2 more grandkids are going to be born this fall. So that's taking over our lives.
I'm Jeff, and I'm jealous of Kevin's beard. I've got beard envy right now. I mean, that's quite like the maturity of manliness that is just exuding from you. And you have a full head of hair. Nathan and I both are bald guys, and so we're looking at you with like super envy, super jealous, and I don't even know why we're speaking, because like the manliness and the wisdom that's going to exude from you is we're just here as spectators. So I'm Jeff. I'm the lead pastor at Movement Church in Woodstock. I'm a dad of 4 crazy kids, ranging from 3 years old, who was our like, oh wow, shock, and then I've got an 11-year-old, a 14-year-old, and a 16-year-old. So there's a lot of stuff happening in our house that's moving. What are my like hobbies? Anything with an engine. So I like fast cars, fast bikes, boats, and anything that gets you a little bit of an adrenaline rush. So that's me in a nutshell.
That's awesome. Thanks, guys. We're so excited to have everybody here today. I do want Cindy to give a welcome as well. We're so glad to partner, the Student Collective with also Children and Family Ministries. So as I guess I represent Student Collective, so welcome youth pastors and junior high pastors and young adult pastors and miscellaneous pastors, I guess. And Cindy, do you want to just welcome, I don't know, make sure people know you're here.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. We're glad to have you on board. And I welcome everyone, especially our kids and family pastors that are with us today. Hope you're all doing well and hanging in there. And we really hope that today's going to be encouraging for you guys. And just let you know that, we're a community ourselves, and we're a family. And we hope that this is a fun and learning time for everybody. So glad you're with us.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome. Thanks, Cindy. In looking to prepare for this forum, we wanted to find a topic that we felt was relevant in our current state of ministry, and recognizing that things are different and things are changing. And the value of community seems to be something that we are recognizing is even more important than potentially we even thought of. And I'm not going to keep going because I don't want to necessarily say anything that somebody else was planning to say, but really excited to have our panelists here with us. They are all absolute experts. I know, Jeff, you can't grow hair, but you'll have great points. I fully believe it. But anyway, without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Nathan, who's our first speaker. But just so you know, we do have the Q&A button at the bottom. We invite you to ask questions. We're going to do short Q&As after each speaker, and then if there's still questions, we'll do a general Q&A at the end. So lots of opportunity to ask them questions, and I encourage you to do that. I'll be making up questions if I have to, but I'd prefer your questions to my questions. So there's a little Q&A button. Feel free to enter things as you go. All right. So
Hey,
without any
Wayne,
further
can we
ado,
talk about the fact that you're wearing an Ottawa Senators shirt on a night that Ottawa just beat last night, Toronto? Can
We
we
don't need to
highlight?
talk about that.
I think
Yeah.
we need to highlight that. That's a
We could
priority in this
highlight that. That's a
conversation.
good point. As a general rule, I always wear something Ottawa Senators the day after the season ends, kind of show my support, even though we're done. But yeah, they did beat the Leafs in overtime last night. I'm just saying, 9 seconds in, Josh Norris. It was beautiful. We started the season with a win over the Leafs and ended with a win over the Leafs. It was awesome.
I was actually thinking of wearing my Austin Matthews jersey today, since just so everyone who's watching online is aware, the Leafs already clinched the division and made the playoffs, so we weren't really even trying last night. But it was still a good game to warm up Anderson. Anyways,
Nathan, you're a hot mess.
So let's get started. We're talking today about community. I'm kind of just preparing the table for Jeff and Kevin and talking about building community and what it looks like in our lives and in our ministry. And so I want to just share with you for a few minutes about what I've learned over the years when it comes to why it's important, what it is, how to create it, and whatnot. And we'll begin with as Simon Sinek says, let's begin with the why. So just to kind of lay a bit of a biblical foundation, the why of a community is simply this, is that what we see in the heart of God is that we were created for community. And so the very first pages of scripture, Genesis chapters 1 and 2, in the creation story, this account in which God created the heavens and the earth, we see that with like very, very little effort and amazing creativity, God put everything together. And throughout, as you know, throughout the story, there's this reoccurring phrase. Every time God creates something new, we read this. It says that God saw that it was good. And so from light to livestock and everything in between, God is happy with what he creates and says that it is good. But then on the sixth day of creation, God creates, mankind, the pinnacle of his creation. But he doesn't simply state that it was good. He actually says that it was very good. In other words, God was most pleased when he created me and you. And then if I quickly flip over to chapter 2, we read in verse 18, we read this kind of striking statement. It says, the Lord God said, it is not good for man to be alone. And what's striking, as you know about this statement, is that the fall has not yet occurred. And so man is still in this perfect state of intimacy with God. He's known and loved by his creator. They walk together in the cool of the evening. And yet the word that God uses to describe us is alone. And he says that this aloneness is not a good thing. And so it suggests to me, and we don't really talk a lot about this, but it suggests to me, because we talk so much about this God-shaped hole in our lives, right? But it would suggest that there's this human-shaped void that God has placed within us that even he will not fill. And so it speaks to this need that we possess as human beings for community. Now, I'm an introvert by nature. And so growing up, I kind of thought, that community was a little bit overhyped, overrated. I thought it was kind of more reserved for the more gregarious types, the outgoing people and whatnot. But what I've come to appreciate and realize in ministry is that community is actually rooted in the being of God. And so I'm sure everyone on this call, is familiar with the concept of the Trinity, that God is triune in nature. But the headline about the Trinity, is not that God is three persons in one. The headline of the Trinity is actually what it tells us about God, that he is a highly relational being. And I say that because I think when I was younger, I was, this is a bit embarrassing to admit, but I think I kind of just assumed that God created us because he was lonely and needed some friends. But that's not the case at all. I mean, God for all of eternity has lived in wonderful, perfect harmony, community in the Godhead. And we see that all throughout Scripture. What we see in Scripture is the Trinity is there to encourage one another, support one another, enjoy one another, love one another. There's this loving, joy-filled sense of community in the Godhead, and it could not be contained. So, I want you to think of something like you've experienced that was breathtaking, that was so good that you instantly had to go and get someone to come along and see it with you. Maybe it was a rainbow, or maybe it was a sunset or something, but it was so beautiful that you wanted others to experience it. And I say that because I believe that's why you and I are alive. The love between the Father and the Son and the Spirit was so good that it couldn't be contained. Some of you on this call probably have kids, and we have kids for one reason or another, but some couples decide to have kids because the bond, the love that they share between each other is so good they want others to experience it. And this is why God created you and me. He wants us to experience this wonderful sense of community that he's enjoyed for all of eternity. In Genesis chapter 1, we read in verse 26, God says, "Let us make human beings in our image to be like us." And so I would just want to remind us as we begin our time together, that because we were made in the image of God, this highly relational being, we have this innate sense, this need for community. It's built into our DNA. It's a part of our genetic makeup. And so this is why, from God's perspective, it's not good to be alone. And so I want to just talk to you about like what is community and how we can achieve it and whatnot. Here at our church, in our context, we've been saying for many, many years that we believe this, that authentic community is the gateway to spiritual growth. And so when we first started saying that many years ago, people would say, well, what is authentic community? And so we define it simply by what we call the ABCs of community. A stands for accountability, and this is not necessarily in a specific order, but A stands for accountability, B stands for belonging, C stands for care. So if you're really going to experience authentic community, there needs to be a sense of belonging, of acceptance. There needs to be a sense of care. And then there needs to be, in addition to that, though, a sense of accountability. And I just really believe that if we're going to survive and thrive in ministry in our personal lives, but then also in our professional lives, create community for others, then we really need to prioritize and value it. And so I just want to tell you about some of the benefits that come from living an intentional community from my own leadership journey. And so just share a few stories with you and offer you a few principles as we get started. I would say the first benefit of pursuing authentic community is preventative care. Preventative care. When I started pastoral ministry when I was 21 years old. And at the time, I recognize Cindy's on the call. She's a counselor. At the time, I had zero concept of self-care. It was not on my radar whatsoever. But a couple of years into ministry, I found myself in a very precarious situation. And without going into detail, the situation had the potential to destroy my marriage and to destroy my ministry. And thankfully, I had carved out a very authentic relationship with another lead pastor in my area, a lead pastor in my area, I should say. They kind of served as a friend and an informal mentor. And so I was really struggling with something. And so I called him up and I said, "Can we talk?" And he said, "Absolutely, you can come over to my office right now." It was my day off, but he was working, and I went over to his office. And I remember just sitting down in that chair and bawling my eyes out. And I told him everything. And I was so grateful that he didn't like freak out on me or say, "I'm going to call your boss right now." He actually said some of the most life-giving words I've ever received. He said, "Nathan, you're going to be okay. We've got this." And then through his support and some really wise boundaries in my life, I was spared from making a terrible mistake. And I can barely even tell you that, even though it was 17 years ago, without getting tears in my eyes, because if it wasn't for that authentic relationship where I had invested into being real and honest with someone, I don't think I would be serving in ministry today. And I tell you that story because I believe that a lot of the heartache and pain that people experience in life is often preventative. But it requires us prioritizing community before we need it so that it's in place when we need it. And just as a pastor, the vast majority of people that I meet with that are in personal crisis, almost always they have one thing in common. And that was that they were not prioritizing authentic community with other people before they got into their mess. And so they weren't in a circle, they weren't in a life-giving small group, they weren't in a mentoring relationship, they were just too busy. They didn't see the value in it. Life was, sailing ahead, things were going well, and so they didn't invest into that. But when temptations and challenges come our way, if we don't have that relational infrastructure in place, then it's really hard sometimes to avoid a disaster. And so I would just say the first benefit is preventive care, is to have that in place before you go through the storm, so it's there when you go through the storm. The second benefit to creating community in your ministry and your life is personal awareness. I like to say this: it's in community where we actually discover our true selves. And it would be fun if we had more time to do a deep dive into this subject, but psychologists talk about the difference between your ideal self, your real self, and your fake self. And your real self is just simply who you are. Your ideal self is who you want to be or who God's called you to be. And then your fake self is who you often pretend to be. And I think this has always been a challenge, but one of the challenges of living in the 21st century is that it's very easy and tempting to project a fake self to other people, especially, I would say in real life, but especially online as well. And whether that's intentional or not, we just, have this ability to deceive others about who we are. And the problem with that is it's all right to fake it once in a while, but the problem with that is that over time we can fool ourselves. So a few years back, I was watching this show on Netflix called The Spy. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's based on the true story of Eli Cohen. It's about this Israeli spy who in the 60s was able to infiltrate the Syrian government. And there's this scene that just I thought was so powerful, because this is a guy who has a family, a wife and kids back home in Israel, but he's now posing as a successful businessman in the Syrian government and whatnot. And there's this moment in the movie where he's no longer able to separate his fake self, who he's pretending to be, from his real self. And I would just remind us that all of us have that ability to self-deceive. One of the realities of being made in the image of God is that means that we are highly creative beings, and we have the creativity to self-deceive ourselves. And so why it's so important we immerse ourselves in intentional community where we can be authentic and vulnerable. And I would just say, really simple definition for that, authenticity is being your true self, and vulnerability is sharing your true self. So what does that look like in my life? Well, in 2018, I did something that I hadn't done before. I'd probably been referring people for over a decade, but I started seeing a professional counselor for the first time. And I wasn't really necessarily going through a personal crisis, but I just needed a safe place to be authentic and vulnerable with someone, and to really just process my thoughts and uncover what I quickly learned I needed to do was uncover some childhood scripts that I'd been carrying with me all through adulthood. And I remember actually when I sat down for the first time, her name is Melanie, and I just said, here's what I'm looking for. Let me know if you can achieve this. I just want to come to a safe place where I can be honest and do the majority of the talking. And all I really need and want you to do is just ask some clarifying questions. Can you do that? And she's like, I can do that. And that began our relationship. And it's just been incredibly life-giving for me. And I think the longer you're an adult and the longer you serve in ministry, the more some of these deep scripts become revealed in your life. And that's why you need to do the hard work of addressing them. So the first benefit is preventive care. The second benefit would be personal awareness. There's so much that I've learned about myself that I didn't know through community. And then the third benefit would be perspective, the perspective we gain from others. Just to clarify, before I say this next thing, is community has been something that I've always prioritized in ministry. I mean, I've had the opportunity to place hundreds of people into small groups over the years. And I've always led a small group. I mean, don't tell the government, but 5 of my guys in my small group came over last night for a bonfire. But about 4 or 5 years ago, I actually became convicted for the first time that I wasn't being kingdom minded enough when it came to community. And so we've all heard of ministry silos. It's this idea of self-contained ministries. I live in a rural setting, so you've got grain silos, you got these great big buildings, and they're right in close proximity to the next silo, but there's no interaction between them, right? And that's often the challenge of traditional ministry, is that you've got ministries serving as separate entities within a church. And so we know that healthy, growing churches are almost always highly collaborative churches. And so we need to have collaborative ministries. And we've always prioritized that in our context here at Lake Point. But God began to convict me for the first time, because he was like, you're not, your church is kind of a silo in your community. Like, you love your other churches, but you're not really living in community with them. And so that led me for the first time to reach out to some of the other lead pastors and just invite them into a relationship where I was like, hey, do you guys want to get together and maybe try and do life together and connect and share? And it wasn't like I said, that was not my pitch. It wasn't like, hey, do you want to like be really intimate with me? I was just like, hey, do you want to get together and get to know each other? And from that, though, it's led to a really life-giving relationship. And it was awkward at first, like it took time to build chemistry, but now when we get together, pretty much from the moment we start, we're laughing, we're crying, we're venting, we're encouraging, and we're able to be transparent in a way that I never could with my pastoral team or with our board or with our congregation. And I think one of the like biggest benefits is whenever we get together, I realize that my problems are not unique. In fact, often I realize their problems are bigger than my problems. So I leave encouraged because I'm like, oh, I've got nothing compared to what they're facing. And so it's just been really, really good. I mean, it's so easy in life to lose perspective, but when you're living in community, it really ensures that your lows don't get too low and your highs don't get too high. And if I could just say this, I don't know what it's been like for everyone else on this call today, but for the three of us, these two guys that I've developed community with, it has been the hardest year in ministry for us, especially I would say the last 3 or 4 months. And all of us have been tempted to quit, and there must just be something in the water down here because people are crazy, but like, not just like quit like our position, but like just leave ministry altogether. And so I think it was back in March that we made this verbal commitment that no one was allowed to resign their position without the permission, the consent of the other two. And so, yeah, we've just been able to develop this bond where we've got each other's backs, where we look out for each other. And I'm embarrassed to admit this, but these were the same guys that I used to be competing with in ministry in my head, right? Like, we got to do a better job than them. We have to launch better initiatives than them. And so it's just so life-giving to actually have each other's backs. So just with like the last couple of minutes for me, let me just share really quickly what that looks like on a ministry side when it comes to building community. And so we've been telling our church for many, many years that they need to connect relationally if they're going to grow spiritually. But one of the things I've certainly learned in leadership is that telling people what they need to do rarely ever works. You actually have to structure and create it for them. And so, like, for example, we've said for many, many years, real church happens, it's an Andy Stanley line, real church happens not when the chairs face forward, but when the chairs face inward and face each other. And so we've been very intentional, though, not just communicating that message, but actually programming it. So for adults in our church, we're very intentional that on the front end of their experience, as quickly as possible, we get them into an introductory group. So we've funneled about 400 to 500 people through what we call Starting Point. It's our own just introductory group that we've created for people on the front end of their experience. And then from there, we either get them into what we call a growth group, which is short-term in nature, or a life group, which is long-term. And because we're very intentional, like we're willing to leverage whatever we need to. So a lot of all of the Starting Point groups, many of the life growth groups, they actually meet on Sunday mornings during our gatherings while I'm preaching. So like I've given, permission for people to leave the rows and literally get into circles during our Sunday morning experiences. And then for like family and youth ministries. So for kids from basically from grades 1 up to grade 12, we've been very intentional with this. And so basically we've made it our mission that whenever a student walks through our doors, whatever the program is, that there will be an opportunity within that program to connect in a small group with a mentoring adult. And so we just worked really hard at that. I would say this, though, not to oversell small groups and whatnot. I would say that my experience has been this: small groups are more like paths to community than actual experiences of community. And here's what I mean by that. They say there's 4 basic types of relationships. There's the public relationships, there's the social, there's the personal, and then there's the intimate. And my experience has been that small groups, no matter how well they're led, they typically will have like they'll create social and personal relationships within that group context. But what we know is that people need intimate relationships to truly grow. And they say that the average person should have 3 intimate relationships. And the more frequency of connection they have with those people, the greater they're going to grow. And so what I'm trying to say is this cannot be achieved in a small group. But what a small group does is it creates the environment, it creates the structure, it creates the opportunity for those relationships to foster, so that out of that small group can come those intimate relationships. And my experience has just been this. For 10 years, I led the small group portfolio in our church, is that very, very seldom do relationships happen organically. People don't typically drift into meaningful community with other people. Authentic relationships don't just happen. There's always some degree of initiative and intentionality that's required. And I've seen like people within our church, they've become best friends. They've started businesses together in their small group. But what I would qualify that is by saying they never initiated that relationship. We were the matchmakers. We put people into environments so that they could develop those relationships. And as I close off, I just want to remind you of a book I mentioned a couple years ago at Time Out. It's called When Relationships Matter. If you're in student or family ministry, it's an easy read, but it's a great read, and I would really encourage you to check it out. So yeah, questions, comments? If you got concerns, direct them to Wayne.
It's good. There's a few questions that were posted in the Q&A, which is perfect. That's exactly how you get a question in for those who are attending today. So we'll start with so the first one. I don't know if you can see these, Nathan, but I'll read them for everybody.
Yeah, hey, Ty. Yep.
Yeah. So this gives. Well, I wasn't going to say who it was, but that's fine.
Too late.
So 2 questions. One, how does the team at Lake Point encourage community practically for your church family? And then number 2, it's my personal experience that many young people struggle to be truly honest and open, particularly those who grew up in religious shame cultures. How do you pastor people and push beyond their comfort zone and truly be open, honest, raw, and vulnerable before an impending crisis forces them to be? Which actually was similar to the question that I came up with as well. So that's good.
So let me begin by talking about the second half of that question. So the only way it's going to happen is if you create a culture of authenticity. And the easiest way to create that, any culture, is to celebrate it. So for us, we work hard at sharing life stories. We actually, as we're working forward in terms of our vision for the church, one of the goals that we have is we get to the place where we share a life story that's authentic and vulnerable every single week we gather. And so as you do that, it makes it so much easier when people recognize that this is a safe place to be real, because you're celebrating that. And not every story is like, something amazing, but it's just people being vulnerable about their brokenness and finding hope and healing. It makes it actually pretty easy for that. The other thing I would say is it's like everything. the leader has to lead first. So if you've taken coaching with our district, you know that you've got to lead with vulnerability. Like, it's interesting. I've worked with a few coaches over the years, including guys like Luch from our district. And it always begins with them telling me something vulnerable enough that if I repeat it to somebody, it would make it a little bit awkward for them. And I'm sure that's very intentional on their part. So leading with vulnerability, celebrating authenticity. And then the first part of the question was, how do you encourage that practically? We don't find encouragement really works. We find that actually tapping people on the shoulder and personally inviting them into community is pretty much the only thing that's worked for us. Because before COVID, everyone was too busy to really value that.
Yeah, that's great. And I think that leads right into the second question, which I'm not going to read the whole question, but the concept is essentially our church has tried, and we believe hugely in life groups. We're having trouble getting people into them and they're like, we can't force people to catch the vision, but any tips on helping people see the value of community?
Sure. So like, depending on your context, there's two options for you that have worked both well for us. So we've created like an assimilation process whereas we invite them into a small group at the front end of their experience. Like, so we've identified them and we've invited them to take this small group on Sunday mornings as a way to introduce them to community and the benefits of it, and to make it a bit disarming for them. And we have a pastor on staff who leads that, so they make sure it's a really comfortable environment. So you can create the structure as a team. But what my experience was when we were starting out, before we had like a unifying structure that everybody on the staff in church bought into, it was a lot of shoulder tapping. So like, some of the people who actually got planted into a group and found it really life-giving were not people who ever signed up. I would just be like, hey, I've got this small group and I think you guys would be a great fit in it. Would you consider trying it out? And I always say to them, can you just try it out for 3 months and then we'll hook up? And if you don't like it, be straight up and we'll find a safe way for you to get out of that group. Mm-hmm. So yeah, a more direct approach I found has been very, very effective.
That's really good. The last question we have is just maybe some tips on how to create new and healthy community within a COVID-19 world.
Yeah, I can't wait for Jeff to tell me all about that. So
excellent. Awesome. Well, if there are more questions that come up, even as things are kind of sitting and you're like, oh, I thought of something else I wish I could have, or I wish I had asked, we will have more Q&A time at the end that's more general. So feel free to keep them coming, and and you can address them even if you just write like, I want Nathan to answer this one, then you can do that, or Kevin or Jeff, whatever, or Nicole. Let's do that too. No, I'm just kidding. But anyway,
can I throw in one question for Nate?
Yes. Yeah.
And this is a bit more on us as leaders, cultivating community for ourselves with other leaders. You touched on a couple of things, but what would be maybe like a couple of strategies or suggestions you would make for us to be able to foster authenticity with other leaders and be vulnerable with other leaders in a way that's safe, in a way that's also like, it's just good leadership. So we're not doing it on social media. We're not doing it, with people that maybe aren't fostering positivity with us. So we can be preventative as well. Do you have any tips for how we can cultivate community as leaders ourselves too?
Yeah, I think you have to have like modest expectations, in that the healthiest way is to start small and let it to build. I think it's John Ortberg that talks in one of his books, about there's levels or layers of authenticity. And so you certainly shouldn't be authentic with everyone. That's something that you build towards in the safety of community. And so in terms of tips, though, I think it's just slowly getting to know people and not appearing needy, and certainly not making it public. So like, I recognize that like in some ways it's exciting to see how people are transparent and authentic on social media, but I don't necessarily think that's the safest or wisest approach. And so like, I'll be interested to hear what the other guys have to say, but I would say this, I've developed some really great relationships through Zoom with some people over this past year. And I would say the virtual connection face to face has been just as easy to create authenticity and vulnerability as in person. So I think it can definitely be achieved. But I think you have to be strategic in the sense of like identifying who that participant can be. So like be wise and savvy with who you're going to identify to pursue authentic community with. So lots of boundaries, lots of wisdom, and pray about it. Like most of the meaningful people in my life, I actually prayed about it for a season. And then I asked God to give me the eyes to see who are these people that I could connect with. Maybe they're already in my life, or maybe I have to reach out and risk rejection in order to invite them into my life.
Yeah, that's really good. Thank you, Nathan, for that. We're going to move to Kevin, who's going to talk about the beauty of messy community.
Thanks. Really enjoyed your thoughts, Nathan. And every time I'm around you, Nathan, you always remind me without knowing it how beautiful your sense of organization and order is. So thank you for giving us some great insights. And I get the job of talking about the beauty of messy community. And, when I think about messy, and I think about who's on this call, first of all, I'd say this about you as church leaders: your tolerance for a mess. You tend to be a lot more idealistic and expect more than other people do in your church. And so if you wonder why some things drive you nuts and other people don't go as crazy about it, it's partly because of how you view messes. Even in leadership, there are people that we least want to associate with, people that we don't want to spend a whole lot of time with in our church or in our community, just because of how messy their lives are. And I have discovered that the only way I can tolerate messes is by having a vision for restoration. And old buildings and broken people in God's repair shop. What can God do to repurpose a life? So part of having a church that can deal with a mess is growing a community of people that can have vision to see past what the presenting mess is. I'll tell you a story, and I'm just going to put my stopwatch on here so I don't preach my way till sunset. So a couple of weeks ago, one of our staff were working, and our bookkeeper, and some of you know Joe Ritchie. He's on staff with us doing the books and some other pastoral stuff. And so this man and his wife show up at the church door. It was near the end of office hours, and man abruptly says, "So I'm here to make a donation." And Joe says, "Oh, great. And I need to have a receipt for it right now." "Okay, no problem. We'll take care of you." So the man reaches in his wallet, pulls out $100 bill, gives it to Joe, and Joe takes down his information. And the guy says, "Well, there's a reason why I'm giving this money." Joe says, "Oh, okay. Well, what's the reason?" He says, "Well, the judge told me I have to make a donation to this place, to this church." Oh, okay. Well, Tell me more. Well, last year during shutdown, I really had to go to the bathroom bad, and I went to Tim Hortons, and their bathroom was closed, and I went somewhere else and couldn't get into the bathroom there, and then I thought, well, I'll go by the church, and maybe the church is open and I can use the washroom, and the door was locked. By this time, I couldn't hold it anymore, so I dropped my pants and had a dump beside your building, and I got arrested, charged with I forget what it was, basically being obscene in public, and so anyways, it was going to be like a $4,000 fine, and the judge said, well, I think that the best thing to do here is you need to go back to that church and just make a donation of $100 to them, and then the gavel comes down. So talking about messy community and the messes that we get into, the messes that other people get into, and what do we do? There's some people that seem to have a special motivation, that they enjoy cleaning, they love organizing, they love restoring beauty and purpose. And if you're one of those people, it's because you have the vision to see beyond the mess to the potential. You'll give your time, more than adequate time, to a mess that you believe is worth redeeming. Well, what is messy? Messy is disordered. And I thought it was appropriate that Nathan started talking about the origins of community. We find the origin of community in the Godhead, where there is perfect harmony, perfect order. And then God creates the cosmos, and it's all good, but the humanity is very good because humanity bears the imprint of community, the ability to relate to the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. And so messy is when we don't have that order in community of peace with God. Messy is also chaos, which is the building blocks of creation. It starts from nothing, chaos, elements that have no way of being in order. And so a mess, there's different things about messy. A mess is something you might hide behind a door. Something may be worth keeping in the midst of the mess, but I can't deal with it now, so I'm just going to close the door. Someone's coming over, oh, we've got to shut the door to that room because we don't want them to see the mess. Messy is a lack of optimal structure, where somebody who has a messy desk or a messy workbench, they can tolerate the mess because they think they know where everything is, and so they'll put up with the mess. But mess can be organized, mess can be restructured, and messy is always a lack of optimal structure. In church life, messy might mean that most of the kids and the youth from the church don't engage in the next gen ministries you provide because there's other priorities in their life and your ministry is low to them. And that creates mess for you as a leader because you want to serve the whole community. And messy might be a church divided over wearing masks, or a church that some people will call their pastor a coward because he's not out protesting and defying the law. Messy is figuring out how to serve and respect people that you don't actually like. Messy is the aftermath of offense and betrayal. Messy is anything that falls below my standard of approval. And community is very messy. So what can you do with a mess? Well, we have a few options of what to do with a mess. You can abandon a mess. You can just walk away, let somebody else deal with the mess. And, we've got a good organizational word for that called delegate. And well, it's not my job. Somebody else can deal with that. You can abandon a mess. You can walk away and let somebody else deal with it. You can redirect a mess. I remember needing to redirect a disorder. There was a person in our church that had a weak bladder. And when we were recording our services with people in the room, they were sitting near the front, and every few minutes they were walking in front of the camera, and it's like, oh. So I arranged the seating plan so that they were sitting closer to where the washrooms were. And we redirect our messes sometimes. Then you can hide a mess. There's a church I know of that had a TV ministry, and this was pre-COVID. We're all TV preachers now, but back when they were one of the few churches that actually had a media ministry. They had all the lights and cameras and switching and production and were doing it well, but they made a decision that when people from the group home showed up in wheelchairs, the people that were nonverbal but would make noise to or rock in their chair and that kind of thing. They said, okay, well, we can't have them in the auditorium. They go into the room at the back and watch through the window, the same room that nursing mothers were in. So, it's like there can be a hiding of what is perceived to be messy for the sake of some kind of preferred social order, and we do a lot of that in church. But sometimes in hiding a mess or ignoring a mess, we also miss out on a greater opportunity. Sometimes we try to impose order. There was a lady in our church who still is, and she's quite elderly now, but she has a very demanding personality, and to boot, she's a hoarder. And so she was always talking to me and complaining about how I didn't know she was a hoarder at first. I knew that whenever she came to church, she always had her walker, and she'd have, like, if she was riding her bike or her walker later after she couldn't use the bike, she'd always have like 6 huge bags full of stuff with her. And she had a kind of demanding personality. She was a messy person, kind of off-putting. But she asked for help because the landlord and the fire department said that she needed to get rid of a bunch of stuff in her place. And so I brought a couple volunteers from the church with me, and we went to her apartment. And literally, there was a pathway this wide that up to 3/4 up the wall, full on every side in every room. and there's this little narrow path to get from place to place. She couldn't use her bedroom, couldn't sleep on her bed because it was buried somewhere. And there was, so there was this incredible mess, and it was just a painful few hours as we tried to help reduce the mess to appease the landlord and the fire marshal. And she had rented a storage unit so that she could move some of her stuff over to the storage unit. And we couldn't get anywhere because she was there with us, and everything that was picked up had to be supervised by her. And it was frustrating because I'm like, okay, let's just get a big dumpster and let's just throw everything in it. And, I mean, I know what to do with a mess, but she didn't. And as a result, there was this incredible disorder in her life. And it's tempting to want to impose order on somebody that doesn't have that sense of orderliness. She felt that the landlord and the fire marshal were treating her unfairly, and so she was evicted eventually, got another place, and started doing the same thing over again. She still deals with that, but I think when it comes to messiness in community, we need to develop a good allowance for messiness. That same woman with a difficult personality, and she's probably brought a couple dozen people into the church with her, and I don't get it, but she finds people that are just as or more messy than she is, and she brings them to church with her, and some of them go through Alpha and some of them get saved, and they're not all dealing with the same mess, but they all have a mess of their own. And there's a verse in Proverbs 14:4 that says, without oxen a stable stays clean, but you need a strong ox for a large harvest. And this crazy hoarder lady is a strong ox that brings the harvest. But boy, the manger is not clean. There is a mess in her life. I think about my wife, Marcia. Marcia is, she's hardworking. She doesn't rest until the house is clean. When it's her day to clean, she just, don't talk to her. Don't have a nap on the couch. That'll be distracting. She's got to mind and get out of her way because she's going to organize, she's going to clean. And I love that about her. But when Luke and Cohen, our two grandsons, come over on Fridays when she watches them, she breaks all her rules of orderliness, and she prioritizes play and presence with those grandsons. And when I come home on Friday from the office and come in the house, I know that the boys have been there. My wife hasn't even showered that day. She's wearing sleep pants and an old t-shirt, and she's a mess, and the house is a disaster. And we order food that day. But it's like the greater order that needs to be established on Fridays is that loving nurture of Luke and Cohen. And they're like 4 and 2. And everybody knows what I'm talking about. The mess is the price of play and presence. The ordering of the relationship temporarily supersedes the ordering of a tidy house. So as church leaders, you need to train your church to take joy in welcoming the mess as an opportunity. An opportunity for God to establish his order. Now, here's the thing about God and orderliness. Jesus is messy. Jesus is messy. He encounters a man who's in such a horrific mess that he lives in chains in a graveyard. He's demonized. And Jesus releases that man. He frees that man. And all of those demons, Jesus sends off into a herd of pigs that rush down the hill into the lake and die. Jesus is messy. He cared more about that man's freedom than he did about the unsympathetic community who could only think about, we lost our pigs. Jesus allows for great messiness. He heals the paralyzed man whose friends literally tore the roof off of the room and lowered him down. Like, talk about an interruption. Can you imagine you're in your ministry room and all of a sudden the roof is coming off and they're lowering somebody down? You know, talk about interrupting your flow. Talk about, being distracting. But Jesus allows the distraction. He allows the mess because there's something better to be done. And messes can be cleaned up after the fact. Jesus overturns the money tables. What a mess. Jesus and his disciples are picking corn on the Sabbath day. What a mess that makes. Jesus takes the Passover and repurposes it to his followers to say, eat my flesh and drink my blood. Jesus dines with sinners that did not or could not or would not conform to the prescribed social order. So Jesus is messy, and if you're going to follow Jesus, he's going to lead you into the middle of horrific messes. Jesus faces the mess. Every healing, every deliverance comes to a person whose life was disordered. Following Jesus means facing the same messes in people, and it's not your job to fix all the messes. It's your job to introduce the kingdom of God and let Jesus enter into the mess. You enter into the mess and Jesus comes with you, and Jesus does the heavy lifting. He's the one that does the ordering in a person's life. As a leader, it's your job to lead by example, and it's your willingness to enter chaos, and it's your willingness to discern the plan to bring order that will inspire others to follow your example. And a great Old Testament example of this is Nehemiah, drawn to the ruins of Jerusalem and calling the community to restore the structure and the order and the purpose. So there is incredible beauty in the messiness of community. You need to have the eyes to see it. So that's my thought for today, and we could go to some questions now. Wayne, you want to bring the questions to me?
Yeah. So we've got a couple of questions. So feel free if something has been stirred to add another question. The first question we were asked is, what are some ways you protect yourself and your community while being in messy community?
Yeah, that's a work in progress. I think that protecting myself, part of my longevity of being in ministry in the same place, in a challenging place, a colorful place, has been that I've been diligent about my boundaries, and at the same time flexible with my boundaries. So I consistently have my day off. Though I had contemplated it at different times, I made an active decision to not live in the neighborhood where we do all our ministry. And there's certainly a value and a teaching about incarnational ministry, that you should live among the people that you minister to. And I think that is true of my lifestyle. That is true of my commitment to be in the community and to be a community builder. But living among, it does not fit my cycle of rest. And I turn off my ringer. I don't want phone calls after I've gone to bed. And if there was a time in early days when my office was on the main floor of the church building, and I had you could access my office from two doors, one on either side of the room. And I'd be working at my laptop. I'd have my church phone, my cell phone, and a door. And sometimes I had somebody talking to me from this door, and somebody talking to me from this door, and somebody calling me on the phone. And I realized that that's a mess. That's a chaos that I needed to have some boundaries around if I was going to get anything done, or if I was going to keep my sanity. So now my office is on the second floor, and you've got to go up about 20 steps to get up here. And usually by the time people get up to my office and sit down in a chair, they're sweating and out of breath because of the stairs. And it gives us just kind of a quiet moment, while they're catching their breath before they start talking. And some of them maybe think, well, maybe I'll wait for another time to go talk to them. I'm not trying to isolate myself or be unavailable. I come downstairs a lot to meet with people, but I also have to have some order that works for me to keep me stable. As far as safety, it's not safe to follow Jesus, so part of safety is learning to be wise as a serpent and as gentle as a dove, and just enter into the mess. I've stepped in between two guys in a street fight across the street from here, and I'm not a fighter, and they could both whoop me if they wanted to, but just stepping in and between them and saying stop, and taking authority in a situation. You can if you're at peace, you can have an incredible authority in people's lives when you're not trying to protect yourself. And so be safe. That was the buzz phrase of 2020. Stay safe, be safe. But it's also a phrase that's antithetical to the kingdom of God.
That's good. And I feel like I could get you to tell stories, ministry stories all day, and just listen to some of them, because I had the pleasure of bringing a youth group to your church years ago, and getting to experience some of the ministry and things that you do. And it's truly remarkable the way that you care for people. Our next question, it can be a landmine. It could be one of those things, but I think it's a fair question, and you can answer it as best you see fit. But this is something that somebody's currently facing. They say, how would you approach the question of being gender fluid / LGBTQ2 in your church / small group, also keeping in mind the conversion therapy bill concerns as well as the truth of God's word? And maybe just speak, because that would be an element of messy community for sure.
Yep. So, yeah, I think a couple things. One is that under current law, it is recognized in the Ontario Human Rights Commission rulings that a church, a faith group, is permitted to have a certain amount of convictions or standards for their community. And so I think it's important that we not just be sloppy with people that are coming from a sexual minority community, but to be honest and say, well, our belief is, and this is what it is, but that's our standard, that's our belief system. But at the heart of that is our incredible belief that in Christ, none of those things matter. In Christ, there is no male or female. There is no master. There is no slave. Paul talks about that. And there is no Jew or Gentile. So if being in Christ becomes what you're most interested in, then we're going to love you. We're going to commune with you. But our standard around certain things is this, and but that's not to in any way humiliate you or make you excluded. Part of the theological tension is the inclusivity and exclusivity of God. And, our societal climate is all about, you have to include me. You cannot exclude me. And, but it's a double standard, because in the demand for inclusion, there is a heightened sense of who they are going to exclude. So we've had transgender people and people who are same-sex attracted, and if their primary objective is fidelity to God, the scripture gives clarity, and we're not trying to convert their attractions. We're not trying to tell them who they are. We're trying to let God show them who they are. And sometimes it comes down to them choosing whether Jesus is Lord or identifying themselves as Lord. And another piece to that, I would say, is that, it has to be a consistent ethic for the whole church community. Married men and women are called to the same fidelity to God that a single person is. And, sexuality can, is sometimes enshrined above discipleship. And so part of our, I think, faithful discipleship in our own life and in the lives of others is to keep coming back to what we're called to be pure unto God. And if you are able to be married in a heterosexual union, Scripture is all about that. And you're always gonna. That is a messy thing, but we don't have to make it messier than it really is. The real mess is the condition of a person towards God, and that's where the Word of God and the Spirit is at work to restore order there.
That's good. Thanks. Thanks for answering. I'm good at grammar in English. Thanks for answering that question there. And those are all the questions again that we have so far. So I encourage you, those of you watching, to enter more questions. We'll have a little bit more time at the end, but we're about to hear from a guy I actually went to Bible college with. And there's some fun stories there, but we won't share any of those here. We'll just turn it over to Jeff.
I think half the people were just actually shocked that I actually went to Bible college, right? And that I actually have a theology. Most people are like, oh, he's just, whatever. So I appreciate you at least highlighting that I do have a degree and it's not just whatever. Yeah, so honored to be here with everybody, and to follow up on such great communicators already. So honored to sit at the table and to talk. You give me the title, Shifting Paradigms of Community, and I was like, man, what does that even mean, right? So been wrestling through it, and it just, for me, as I started thinking about what does that look like, what does that mean, there's a couple things that really kind of stood out to me. There was a time and season where community was really based on family, right? Like everyone lived close to their families, they lived on the farm, they lived in that scenario, and that was your community, that was your village it took to raise your kids, right? And with the industrialization, we moved out of the idea that it was directly family to now it was more geographically and built around like the kids I go to school with, or built around people I'm working and go to work with, right? Built around some common interests, maybe, right? Like I'm on a sports team together with people, and that was now becoming our community. And now we're seeing, and before even COVID, right? Like COVID, we blame COVID for a lot of stuff, and it has highlighted a lot of things. But before COVID even started, we started seeing shifts take place in people's definition of community and what drove their community. Geography has actually for a long time no longer been a major driving force, at least in the next generation, for community. We did a podcast called On the Couches, and I did run 2 of them with Next Gen. So just sitting down with students who are in high school or just out of high school and said, like, talk to me about what you need from the church. And I've got 2 teenage kids and a preteen. So I was blown away by some of the stuff that was shared. And one of the things that one guy named Landon, that he shared, he actually talked about the fact that he has friends that he considers deep personal friends that he has no intention in his entire life ever meeting face to face. That these are friends that he has connected with over Xbox, and he plays on Xbox with them several times a week, and good friends, but he will never see them face to face. He'll never hang out with them in a group. They'll never get together and see a movie. They just are Xbox. But their friendship, their community has nothing to do with their geography. It has everything to do with just common interests. Another thing that blew me away about just the shifting that is taking place is what's happening in the workplace, right? So many companies are moving away from the idea of like you all have to gather in one environment to do work, right? We're now moving to digital communities for workspaces, and this has huge implications, right? They're talking about how this is changing the urban planning of cities, because also now the high-rise building is not so much of a priority, because people are like, why would I spend all that money on renting 4 floors and navigating all of that expense when I can just help people have internet at home and empower them at their home offices? It's way better for urban planning. We know it's better for the environment, right? Traffic is down. So there's lots, and quite honestly, right now what we're doing, right? If this was live, how much more expensive would this be? If we, Wayne would be providing a lunch, right? There'd be some kind of food. We would have all had to take in, 45 minutes to an hour to drive to the event, and then 45 minutes, an hour to drive back. We're going to be done and said in 2 hours, right? And it cost us nothing. So there's like, wow, this is really working. And so companies are moving that way. Another thing that I've noticed is my kids have actually been going to concerts through COVID. I'm like, what? They're actually like they were talking to me. I came down one day and they're on Fortnite, and they were at a live premiere concert of some artist who was dropping a new album, and they had their little avatars and they're like dancing around and doing all these weird dances in Fortnite to concerts, right? And I'm like, this is crazy. This is crazy that they're there with their friends, their online friends in this concert. They all had to show up at a certain time and watch this concert in a totally 100% digital format. And they don't view that as any less valuable to them than what they had, going to an actual concert. We know that Amazon is here to stay. Shopping has completely changed, right? Rather than that idea of the big mall that is now been, no, like we know that blockbuster movies, right? Like we had a huge thing take place with Godzilla versus Kong. Okay, movie, right? But it shattered the box office in the pandemic. And what did they realized that that movie through streaming made $60 million on the box office weekend through streaming, right? So no longer is the idea of like, oh, I got to go to a movie theater to watch something and have that community engagement. It's like, no, $60 million was funded through people going, I'll buy it on Apple TV, or Disney Plus is releasing, the Marvel movies are starting to start come out on Disney Plus, because they're realizing that there's a shift that's taken place in people's understanding of engagement that maybe was birthing before COVID, but COVID has exploded. And so for me, when I start wrestling through and looking at these kind of things and listening to the next generation, seeing my kids and watching what I'm reading, there's three implications that really hit me for a leader about building community, right? One of them is a statement. So I'm a pastor, right? So it has to be 3 points, and we're taking up an offering at the end. But there's one thing that Kerry Newhoff, if you read anything he's been saying, he's been dropping this for a long time. And then the first one is that the front door of our church has completely moved, right? It used to be the front of your church was like the lobby, and everyone was like focusing on lobbies, and we all built these cafes because like we're gonna make a lobby that's a beautiful front door, and it's great. It's gonna be a sense of community, and that was our spot. And then we realized, the front door is not that awesome. The lobby's cool, but now we were all like, we need parking teams, right? Like you got to have the people holding those cardboard signs or plastic signs at the street and saying like, welcome home. And we need parking teams with smiles and waving. And we invested in putting speakers in our parking lot so that it was like, welcoming when you came in. It's like, yeah, the parking lot's the front door. And then all of a sudden it's like, no, you got to have a really epic web page, right? Like people are going to go on, they're going to want to see, they want to get an idea, a taste, they want to see your vision and your belief systems, and they want to read the reviews. Anyone ever checked your Google reviews of your church? It's one of the funniest things in the world to do, right? Like who's Google reviewing the church? But anyways, right? Like, but people are like, you need to have that. You need to have testimonies on your web page because that's your front door. And what we're learning right now is that now your experience online is your front door. In fact, they're stating, I don't know who they are, but you read it everywhere, that no one's come to your church in the future without going online and watching you first. They're gonna go online. They're gonna watch your experiences. They're gonna watch your services. They're gonna watch the stuff that we're doing. They're no longer showing up going, I don't know what's going on in here. They know how you dress. They know how you talk. They know what your music is like. They know what you're saying. They know your whole belief system. They've probably watched several of your sermons or your experiences before they even consider to come into your building. Well, that's a powerful thing to go, man, how do I address this? So I don't know about you. We've been on this journey of going like, how do we keep making our conversations important, right? Like everyone, if the front doors change. So, TikTok forced us into going, man, you got to have a bunch of good 1 minute clips because a 1 minute clip, people are watching TikTok. You got to have this 1 minute clip. So you break down into 1 minute ideas. Then Reels friggin' came out and said, no, you got to do it in 30 seconds. I'm like, what the heck? Man, we went from 1 minute to 30 seconds. Like, it was 25. Well, remember when it used to be 45-minute sermons? And then it was like, okay, anything under, 30, over 30 or too long. And then now it's like, oh, 1 minute. And then now 30 seconds. Stories is 15 seconds. And what we actually realized, now I'm old. Okay. So I'm putting out there, I'm even older than Nathan. Like I'm 45. Like it's scary. But so I still use Facebook. I know I'm with your grandparents. I know everyone watching this, you're all young and cool. You're like, Facebook, like, yeah, grandma uses that. But on Facebook, we stream our experience to Facebook, and it's so encouraging. You're like, man, there's 7,000 people watch that sermon, right? And you're like, that's so awesome. And then you go and look at the stats. It's like, oh, 6,980 of them only watched it for 10 seconds or less, right? You're like, oh man. And so we're actually going, man, if that's our front door, we actually have to evaluate everything we do through a 10-second window, right? And like, that's crazy. So we say, go, man, okay, we're going to do an offering. How do I, if that's the only 10 seconds someone's going to catch in my service because they're scrolling, how do I make sure that that's compelling enough that they might actually they might not scroll past? If I'm going to do a welcome, how do I make sure that the welcome is done in a way that if that's the only 10 seconds someone sees in my church, they're actually going to watch it and they're going to maybe engage a little longer, or music or whatever else. It's really put us in this spot saying, man, like, how do we stop the scroll? And how do we make sure that the language we're using, the energy we're producing, the quality that we're saying it in is actually good enough that somebody would actually stop and watch? We actually there's a video releasing on TikTok on tomorrow from our church. And it's really good, but I have to admit, like, it's really good. But when I was watching, I was like, guys, how long is this video? It feels like it's 10 million years long. And they're like, yeah, it's actually 58 seconds, so we can do it. I'm like, dude, that felt like forever all of a sudden, because everything we're watching is so fast, right? So it's being really cognitive of going, man, like, let me look through my recordings. Let me look through my experiences that we're producing online and go, is it in 10 seconds? Like, is there drop mics? Is there bad sound? Is there stupid stuff we say just because of the fact we say it, right? So that was something that we just been wrestling through with building community online. It's been, like, our front door shifted. We got to change our focus. The second thing that really stood out to me was church is no longer restricted to a time and location. So one of the depressing things as a lead pastor is I'm like on a Sunday watching all the live views, right? I'm like, oh man, like I want like the world to be watching, right? Like I'm arrogant enough. Like I want to see like 10,000 people watching our church service, right? And then you're like, oh, there's 80. Awesome, right? Like how much money, how much stuff am I doing? Like this is crazy. And what we've actually noticed is that what we see on Sunday morning we'd run one at 9 and 10:30, and then what we see by the end of Sunday, it's increased. What we actually notice is that 7 days later, it's actually doubled. Majority of the time in 7 days, our viewership has doubled in 7 days. And then it goes on a growth cycle, a steady growth cycle for up to 6 weeks. Generally after 6 weeks, it runs out of the algorithms and it's no longer a high priority unless someone's actually searching and engaging with our church through that being our front door and they want to see more and more and more of our stuff. But generally, our stuff grows for 6 weeks at a massive, way more than Sunday morning, right? Way more than a Sunday morning. And so this has had to make us really cognitive of what are we doing, what are we saying, and what's our language. We use a term around our leadership team. We have to really focus on everything being evergreen, right? So point in case, Thanksgiving was really difficult for us because we've got a Canadian Thanksgiving, but we actually have a lot of audience from America. We have people who are watching from around the world that don't have the same Thanksgiving. So if we were to use Thanksgiving as a major theme, then we would actually be disconnecting from a whole bunch of people who are engaging with our experience. So we have to go, oh man, like we got to talk about topics that are evergreen. We got to make sure that when we're hosting, we don't say, good morning, welcome to Sunday morning church. We're so excited, because we're recognizing that most people right now are going, hey, I love having breakfast and hanging out with my family and not being in the rush and showing up to church at 4 o'clock or 7 o'clock before I go to bed. And I'm old, I go to bed at 8, okay? But like it's like I'd actually like to rather watch church then. So if we're like very first thing is, hey, good morning, welcome to church, it's also immediate disconnect, right? Immediately it's like, oh man, like you actually aren't building this for me. So we have to really be cognitive. What is our language? What themes are we sticking to? You know, are they universal themes, or is this a really targeted, localized conversation? Because our community has shifted to no longer just being local, where you show up on a Sunday morning and gather, but you're actually watching all the time throughout the week or evergreen. The other thing that we've realized in this season is Sunday mornings, and this is hard for me as a lead pastor, okay? Sunday mornings is not the experience for everyone. I like, as a lead pastor who's like, I've got 21, 22 years of ministry experience. It was all about, as a youth pastor, you know, Wednesday night or Friday night, like that was everything. Or now as a lead pastor, like Sunday morning is like, that's the Super Bowl. We use that language at our church all the time. It's the Super Bowl. Every week it's Super Bowl. Like this is game day. And what we realize is like, man, like, yeah, there's a lot of people that connect with our community of Sunday morning or throughout the week. But we actually have heard Brady Shear used to say this a lot, is that you got to take back the other 6 days. And so we actually have realized that Sunday morning and the preaching and the music and all that stuff reaches a demographic that's awesome. But there's people that are connected with us now. We will also do a podcast. We do a video vlog style thing that have their own unique audiences that claim that they're part of our church because of it. So I have a personal friend who's far from God and has been on a journey of just being angry at God and feels like God actually ruined his life. He grew up in a highly religious home. He actually grew up in a pastor's home and just angry at God. Feels God, you know, that his parents lied to him, the church ruined a bunch of stuff, like just, you know, de-churched. But we're really, really good friends. And he's like, like, dude, I have zero interest in watching your church service, man. Like, it's just boring. It's fake. It's also, I'm like, oh, thanks. I'm so glad we're friends. Right. But he's like, but dude, like, I don't miss one of your on the couches, because you guys actually like really talk about real issues and it's authentic. And, you know, and I'm like, he's really part of our church. He's engaging with Christianity. He's engaging with God. He just doesn't know it, but he's engaging with God. Yet would never walk in our front door, would never be part of our Sunday morning experience, but he's part of our community, part of Movement Church, because he's engaging with a completely different style of product, right? So what we realize is like, man, we can't just go, okay, well, Sunday mornings is the answer, and we just put all of our money, all of our energy into Sunday mornings. It's like, no. We have to diversify what we're doing. We have to be on there. So we do On the Couches podcast, we do Real Talk with the Pastor, which is our blog. We do a worship devotional, because we have people who are engaged with movement worship and love movement worship and the album, the EP we put out, but have zero intent of actually like listening to me preach, right? They're like, no, man, he sucks. Like, but the music is so good. But they're part of our community now, right? So we're just learning that we have to have multiple ways. The other thing what it's done is, by that multiple, we actually had to learn to change our social media stance. For years, we were like, come and see. We're the best show in town, right? Like, let me tell you about why Movement Church is awesome. Let me tell you about this program we're running. Let me tell you about Sunday morning. And it was all about like very narcissistic, right? Like, I'm awesome. Come check me out. You know, Movement Church is awesome. Come check us out. So we had to change our language to going, how do we actually serve? It's kind of like New Amsterdam, you know, how do I help, right? What can I do to help, right? And we've had to take on that approach in our social media of like, okay, no, like we spend more time promoting, how can we pray for you today? We do these polls and we do all this stuff that's trying to be engaging to try to go, no. We can't be about promo and self-promo and narcissistic, because to people now, this is the only picture they have of us, is the social media and the online presence. They're gonna be part of our community. They have to feel like we're not all about ourselves. We're actually about them. And then the last thing that hit us for community is we had to shift our model from creating an awesome Sunday morning experience to creating opportunities for engagement. And this is probably one of the hardest things from a guy like me who likes the big experience, the big production, the big show, the big crowd, right? Like, come on, you all love the big crowd when you're doing your youth ministry, your kids ministry. It's awesome when there's like 100 kids, and not so awesome when there's 2 and they're your pastor's kids, right? Like, you're like, we love the crowd, right? Like, you're like, yes, this is awesome. So we had to make this shift to go, no, we're going to focus more on opportunities for engagement. So what that has meant for us is we've recognized that our community has changed in that we're no longer just a Woodstock community with a few outlying regionally close places. We legitimately over this season, over the last year, have seen our church influence grow to where we actually have people in Kentucky tithing, giving money every single week to us as a church. So like, and that's big as a lead pastor, someone's giving like, oh, they're actually with us. Like they're not just saying they're like, there's money on the table. This is like legit. And they're giving. We've got 4 or 5 families in Kentucky that are giving and now in a small group, being in a small group through Movement Church. So our small groups, what we've done is because it's an online format, and I'm like, I don't, they're already going and listening to great guys like Nathan and Kevin preach, and they're downloading their messages as well as mine. So I'm like, no, I got to make sure our small groups are at least built around our sermons. So that way I know that they're somehow engaging with Movement Church, and Movement Church is staying, the voice in their lives. So our small groups are built around our Sunday experiences as far as the message. But you can run a small group on Sunday or any other day of the week, is just watch the message and then gather and talk about it. And what we're seeing is really 2 things that are really cool is we're seeing people from all over the world actually attending our online small groups. So we've got people from, like I said, Kentucky, people from BC are engaged in our small groups, people from Ottawa engaged in our small groups. We got people from Uganda. This is one of the coolest stories. I just have to share it because I had nothing to do with it, so I can really brag on our small group leaders. Natalie, who's actually on the forum right now, this is her small group. But we have a guy, a husband and wife from Uganda that engage with us, are part of our community. They're engaged with us. They attend a small group. So they get up at like 6 in the morning to watch our experience and then jump on the small group afterwards with Natalie. And him and his wife, or his wife more, is pregnant and they're about to have their kid. And it's a 90-minute taxi ride from their house to the hospital to deliver the baby. And they were just sharing like, it's stressful, all that kind of stuff. And our small group bought into that and raised just among themselves over $500 and have wired it to them, said, listen, we're going to take care of that taxi ride. We're going to take care of some of the expense of the baby. Once you transfer that into Ugandan money, it's a massive amount of influence for them. And so we've just, as a community, wiped out a whole major stress of what they had giving birth because they're legitimately part of our church, right? We had a family member, a person in Abbotsford who now attends our church, and her mom passed away during COVID. And Movement Church was able to send flowers and connect with them. Be like, hey, we're here for you. We're not physically able to ever see you, but we're actually investing in you and your culture. We do porch drop-offs every single week. Not every single, once a month. Once every 6 weeks, we do a porch drop-off. But we're now mailing stuff all around North America to people to go, hey, you know what? You're part of Movement Church. So here's the deck of cards we're giving this week to let you know, hey, hang out as a family and play some cards or poker. No, don't do that. Right? Like we've shifted our mindset from just the local, what we see on a Sunday, and to small groups, being able to actually engage people. And people from all over North America are actually attending our small groups and finding authentic community. The other thing that we're doing as a leadership team is we're actually sitting and thinking, okay, well, what does this mean? And it's shifting our perspective of what church planting actually looks like, right? Because now what we're saying is, I've got some people that I know that are in Ottawa. I grew up in Ottawa Senators fan. And we now have a large following of people who engage with us on Sunday mornings from Ottawa and are engaged in small groups, right? And so what we're looking at going is, okay, well, what would it look like once we're allowed to have gatherings? If those people who are engaged in small groups with us, what if they actually had a small group in Ottawa? And what if we actually empower them to be a church? Like, what if we said, okay, you know what, you've got to do 4 or 5 missional outreaches as a small group in your community. So Movement Church will take care of a food drive in the middle of Ottawa. Movement Church will do a coat drive or whatever, but it's no longer close to us. And what if that small group can multiply to 2 or 3 small groups, which would then lead to us creating a watch party where we rent a facility or something where they can gather to watch the experience. which could eventually lead to a staff member, eventually lead to a worship team, eventually lead to a full-fledged church. And then I'll get in trouble because I'm planting a church in Eastern Ontario district. I'm a Western Ontario credential holder, and it'll just make everybody angry at me, and that's fun. But ultimately, you can start changing the world through this concept of going, hey, we have, like I said, 6 or 7 people in Kentucky that are now meeting as a small group and watching our experience and inviting their friends because they're not actually stuck in lockdowns. And they're inviting friends to their house to watch church together. And we also have this small stirring of like 10, 12 people on a Sunday or one day during the week, watching church, engaging in our questions and giving. And we're now going to empower them to start doing outreach, right? We could actually very simply from Podunk, Woodstock, start having a ministry that's engaging community all around the world, because community concepts have completely shifted from, well, it's Sunday morning, 9 o'clock in the morning in my local community, to we engage and embrace online presence. I've run out of my 20 minutes, so I will bring that to a conclusion. Hopefully that was somewhat helpful. I talked really fast because 20 minutes is not long. Yeah, I'll leave it to questions from you, Wayne, if there was any.
Yeah, we've got some questions. I will say great job. And all of our panelists, we originally, when we were doing this in person and when I originally invited them, I said, yeah, you'll have like 45 minutes to an hour. And then it was like, now we're going Zoom, cut it down. We're going 20, 25 minutes. So
which is actually beautiful. I'm going to say, like, I'm so appreciative of that, because I'm like, 45 minutes, man, I'm not good enough to talk for that long. 20 minutes, I can fake it. It's great.
You could do a whole sermon series in 45 minutes. You could do like 3 weeks. It's perfect. Anyway, couple of questions that came in. Well, we could start actually. Well, Kevin asked a couple in the chat. I'll start there and then go into some of the other ones. But in the race to 10-second communication, how do we also address the appetite of others who listen to or view 2-hour podcasts?
For us, that's why we recognize our different audiences and our different goals of those, right? So a Sunday morning is we still view that, not necessarily that it's on Sunday mornings, but that Sunday morning experience, the worship and the preaching, that's our big kind of promotional good. That's where we're spending tons of money on advertising. We're putting it on Facebook, we're putting it on YouTube, we're putting it all over the place. And it's really that front door of like, hey, we just want you to see, and it's our best foot forward. So we recognize for that, that's what we're breaking down. Our podcast, 45-minute long, an hour long podcast, and people actually listen. I'm like, what in the world, right? But I'll tell you, one of the things that blew my mind, right? Because we hear all this about the long format and how valuable it is, and a lot of leaders have talked about it. But that's another thing. When I talk to these next gen people and was sitting down with youth, I'm like, tell me, one of them was my son, and I'm like, tell me, like, how do you consume? And they're all like, man, Sunday mornings takes me 3 days to get through. I'm like, what? They're like, yeah, it takes me 3 days. They're like, I get more watching Stephen Furtick, hate him, right? No, I love him. He's awesome, but it's a freaking loser, right? I get more watching a 1-minute TikTok video of Stephen Furtick that inspires me to live for God and pray than I do sitting down and listening to you speak for a whole 25 minutes. I'm like, I'm only 25 minutes. I grew up with church where they preached for an hour, right? So as much as like, yeah, we're hearing that and we create different formats for the long format, I'm actually really curious to research the next gen, because everyone talks about millennials and like, we're old, dude. Millennials are old. If we're not paying attention to Gen Z, we're actually really missing the next future. And my limited exposure to Gen Z is that they're really buying into TikTok and Reels, and that is like their meat. So we're cognitive of that. We're trying to work with that, but then we have our long format in another system.
That's good. And that leads to another question we were asked, which I think is pretty universal amongst the youth pastors I talk to, is like talking about like, what do you do when youth don't want to engage with online content? Many groups have tried different online options and the buy-in is ineffective. Students expressing, hey, we want youth back. We don't want to do Zoom. We don't want to do whatever. How would you respond to that?
So I think that well, first off, Justin should be really responding to that. He's doing a killer job for us in youth ministry here at Movement. what I'll say is very personal in the sense that, I mean, I've got 3 kids doing online school, and I'll look at my youngest one. So she's in middle school. So it's not my middle youngest. She's in middle school. She's just in grade 6. She's just started Justin's middle school program. She is online all day, every day with school, and she loves it. It blows my mind because I'm like, this is like hell. I'm teaching her. This is bad. Okay, like she's gonna be dumb, right? But she will do online school, and then while she's doing online school, she's got her phone open with chats to all of her friends, and they're all like talking to each other. And then school is over, and her friggin' computer's ringing off the hook from all of her friends, and they're all engaging. And then she's going to youth on whatever once every 2 weeks with Justin, and then she's going to her cousin's youth group, and she's going to another. I'm like, this girl's like loves being on her computer so much that we had to like you got to stop, right? Like you got to come actually engage with us as a family because you're just up here in this computer all the time. So that is something I'm wondering if like the younger generation actually is really embracing it more than just the teenagers and the student ministries right now. Because my kids are the same way. They're like, we love Justin, we love youth, but like let's hang out in person. So this is me just spitballing and being an old man, okay? Like I'm recognized I'm not a youth pastor for a reason. But I wonder if the Zoom and those things, I wonder if going more the vlog style, like, because my kids seem to be like, yeah, like we don't want to be on Zoom and be a youth, but they will consume everything on YouTube for hours, right? And different YouTube people. Not that I'm saying you have to become a YouTube star, because like that's really hard. Those guys have lots of money and everything else, and they can just like, yeah, I'm going to give away an island today to the last person who pees, right? Like it's like, what in the world? I don't understand it, right? But I wonder if there's just something there that's like, hey, maybe our goal isn't so much the idea of like the major gathering point of like what it used to be with like we all have to gather on a Wednesday, to creating community through authentic small groups and through, you know, really cool creative video teachings. I don't know. I'm not a youth pastor, thank God.
It's fair. So this came up a couple of times in the questions. It's a slightly different angle, but many of us serve as support pastors. We support our lead pastor who sets the vision, and looking at, you know, a lot of what you're talking about sounds great from a support side. But what about how do we communicate these? I'll read the question. It's like, how do we communicate these values to our lead pastors if they aren't necessarily seeing or connecting these values?
Yeah, so I think there's 2 things. I think one, everything I talked about, you could look at your own student ministries or kids ministry and go, can I apply these to my own ministry? So instead of going like, wow, if our lead pastor or our church would do it this way, then we'd be good. Why don't you set the stage, right? Numbers speak to a lot of pastors. So if you could start doing that in your own ministry, in your environment, and then you could go to your pastor like, hey, look, our kids ministry has actually grown in influence. We have families that are engaging with us that never engaged with the church because we're doing kids ministry like this, or youth ministry like this, or look at what the numbers are producing. You know, I think that would speak volumes to actually giving you a seat at the table. One, I think it really would go, hey, okay, well, maybe there's something I'm missing. I know not every lead pastor is open to hearing to the next generation, but I think that shouldn't be the excuse to hinder you from doing what you're doing in your ministry, right? You kill it in your ministry with the resources you have. Do the best you can with the finances and the opportunity. Like, not everyone's got great cameras, but in this world, you don't have to have great cameras. You can do things totally cool with not great cameras. I mean, like, it's blowing my mind, some of these artists that are doing, you know, album releases, and it's like them and a computer and a guitar, right? Like, they're just being authentic. So figure out how to work these tools to your advantage in your community with these mindsets in place, and then maybe we'll speak to the broader church at large. The other thing I think is quite serious, that I think is one of the hardest things that we as lead pastors, and I'm hoping we'll talk about it at a district level, we all used to say this statement, if your church closed its doors, would anyone in the community care? And we've just all closed our doors for a year. I mean, Movement Church has not actually been open for 15 months. We have not had an in-person experience for 15 months. There's a lot of churches that now have the answer to that question. It's probably not very positive, right? There's a lot of churches like, hey, we've been closed for a year and no one but our own people cared that we were closed. And how do you bring that up to a pastor? Well, you got to be really careful because you don't want to get fired. But what I think you have to do is, I will tell you, me as a lead pastor, I want to hear, but I also want to hear through humility, right? The struggle that happens when I was a youth pastor is I thought, man, I got my thumb on the pulse. I understand stuff. I'm seeing things, right? And I just need to let my pastor know. And it came across really silo focused because I was seeing it only from my perspective and not seeing the grander picture of budgets, not seeing the grander picture of community influence, not seeing the grander picture of who the lead pastor has to answer to, and all of those different things that are on the lead. I saw it through like my limited view of what leadership looked like and my leadership experience. And I almost was arrogant in how I approached it. But the times I sat down with a guy like Pastor Peter McIntosh and said, man, I'm heartbroken and I know I don't see everything, but let me tell you, this is what I'm struggling with, or this is, I just see this. And I would love for you to wrestle through this with me, because there's this opportunity, or there's this moment right now that maybe we don't want to miss. And let me sell you on it from this perspective of it. And I recognize I'm young. I recognize I'm immature. I recognize I don't have all the answers, but let me, and you know what? That's going to go a lot further than the lead pastor thinking you're talking bad about him to all your friends and like, oh, he's an old archaic pastor and he doesn't know anything. And if you come and soft sell it and come in humility, and if your pastor doesn't listen to it, that's cool. That's his prerogative, her prerogative. Like maybe they have a different perspective. Maybe they're seeing something, and you can only then, like I said, go back to your area and go, I'm going to kill it in my area, and hope that actually speaks volumes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that concept of, yeah, you want to have the relationship and you want to talk with your lead pastor or whatever, but at the end of the day, you have your own area of responsibility. And there's times I've been in circumstances many times where it's like, this whole entire situation is not ideal, but I'm going to control what I can control, and I'm going to raise the bar where I have influence. And even if that means years later or months later, they're coming to you saying, hey, what are you doing? Why is this so good? I'm not a panelist, but I had this moment where I met with my leadership team and I was complaining about our youth group social media. And I was like, man, we're just not where we wanted to be at that time. And then I literally went into staff meeting the next day, and the entire team brought up, man, the youth group's social media is awesome and we want to be more like you. And I was like, oh, okay. And it was like, sometimes it's perspective and shifting and stuff. So I want to open to
Can I just say one other thing, Wayne, about that though, that I think I'd be amiss to not say in it is, I think that we have to be wise in understanding where we're working and understand how authority works inside the kingdom, right? So although you are a student ministry or a family ministry pastor or associate pastor, and you are called by God and you have a voice and you are being raised up to lead the next generation and beyond, and your future is still powerful, you also are called to serve where you're at. And if you're at a spot, and you're going to hate me, Wayne, for saying this, but if you're at a spot where you're like, no, I just don't agree with how my pastor is wrong, probably in that scenario, it's time for you to be looking at exit strategies. Because at the end of the day, whether your pastor is wrong or right, they're the ones called in that spot, and they're the ones that have the vision for it. And it may not be right. It may be a dead, archaic system. It may be bringing the church to destruction. That's not your call. If they're doing something immoral, then there's leadership values that you can take and bring to leadership teams in the district. But if it's like, man, like this is just an archaic system and I want to just turn the world upside down, and that's awesome. Do the best you can in your ministry. But if it's coming to a spot where you can't see eye to eye with your leadership team, then odds are it's time for you to go find another place to serve. Mm-hmm. Do you still love me, Wayne? Is this my last time speaking at a youth and kids forum? I get it. Happens to me a lot. I speak once and no one ever has me back.
Yeah, that's a real place. I totally get it. But absolutely, I would enforce that as well. And I would talk, the other emphasis I would just say is sometimes there is a reconciliation that can happen. But if you're right, if you can't work with the person that you're working with, if you can't, find that, then there may be maybe that's some of the discontent that God stirs in us as we are to be looking for what he has next for us. Absolutely. I want to open up the questions. There's a few questions here. Feel free to enter more. We don't have a ton of time, but I want to open up just a couple more, and there's some that are directed at specific people. And so Kevin, this question is specifically for you, and I just lost it. So give me patience. Now I don't see it. So
I found it.
Literally, it
said,
perfect. Yes, read that question. It said Kevin, and then I don't know where it went.
Let me just say that Anonymous, you have a lot of questions.
I know Anonymous is so like, I don't know. No, it's good.
The question is, how do you engage in messy community without a bait and switch mentality or having an agenda? I'm engaging in your mess so that you engage in the local church, come to faith in Christ. That's a great question, and I think that question speaks to what is our heart, what are we all about, and it's important to value every person because they're made in the image of God, and to recognize that not everybody that we are going to encounter is there to meet our purposes or our agenda as a ministry. So having a consistent love approach to everybody that we encounter, and recognizing the limits of interaction. Thinking more about how to be responsive and serve everybody, not just people that are in the agenda of New Song Church.
And that's recognizing their own internal kingdom value, right? And it being about them. Absolutely. Yeah, it's good. I'm gonna throw just questions out here. So this one maybe is directed at Jeff, but I'll welcome anybody to answer it. It's like, what are some practical examples of ways you've switched from, and they use the Sunday Super Bowl experience to engagement, but I think you're all welcome to weigh in on this. What are some ways you've switched to engagement versus experience? Is how I read that question. So you can start, Jeff, and then anybody else can weigh in.
Well, I just stole from Stephen Furtick, put it in the chat. That's just right? You just say that a bunch of times, and that's now engagement. I don't know. I have a love-hate with Stephen Furtick because he's so freaking awesome, but then it's like so unattainable to reach to, right? So everyone's like, "Oh yeah, I listened to you on Sunday, and then I listened to Stephen Furtick afterwards." I'm like, "Thanks, great." Feel insecure now. So a couple things for us, right? So this is where we said we focus on multiple different outlets, right? So we're like, okay, Sunday mornings is not Super Bowl anymore in the sense that it's our biggest only production that we do. It used to be that we'd have like our youth pastor, our kids pastor, and then I have like 6 people who work on just Sunday mornings, right? The worship pastor, the community, all these different people. Whereas now we're like, no, we're putting equal playing field on a lot of this stuff, right? So we're setting priorities up on the couches and real talks and worship on our midweek worship experiences, right? So we've set those as high priorities, and we've taken our focus of Sunday and say, okay, it's really our evangelistic opportunity. It's really now that moment where it's like, hey, if you just wanted to get your appetite wet towards God, then this is that. So we still place a high emphasis on production value because in this world, bad sound is the first thing that will take people away from wanting to engage with you, right? So we've placed high emphasis on it. It's still a high priority, but we're now putting a ton of emphasis on other content that's coming out throughout the rest of the week.
That's good. Anybody else want to weigh?
Yeah, I'll take it in a different direction to answer the question, and specifically family ministries. I actually think in some ways, if you're in family ministry, it's easier to connect with families now than ever before. For example, our staff sends out weekly emails to all the parents to stay connected. And I'm talking specifically of the community you already have established. And those emails are designed not to want something from them, but just to provide something for them. So encouragement, perspective, some parenting tips and whatnot. And, you're not going to get every parent reading every email, but when you consistently do something, you start to establish a connection. Another thing we've done multiple times, and I'm sure many people on this call have as well, but doorstep visits where we'll blitz everybody in our database for a 5 to 15 minute conversation on their doorstep. And we always bring a gift with us. It's always spontaneous. They're not aware that it's going to happen. And so we just finished doing that this past week with all the families connected to our church. And like, this is the second or third time that our staff have done that. And so they're making connections that are actually much more powerful than in our building, because how often does a kids pastor interact with a dad? Like almost seldomly never, unless they're picking up their student. So now they're on their door in their safe spot, and they're talking about how they're, surviving the pandemic or whatever. And so I actually think our staff has better connections with most family and most parents than they did pre-COVID. So just being intentional at going out and connecting with people, whether it's through email or through face-to-face visits.
And so just to follow up, because there's a question that I think that leads into really, really well. How would you suggest connecting with those families who are saying like, we'll be back when we're in person, but we don't want anything to do with any of this online stuff? They've decided to check out and then they'll just come back later. And anybody can weigh in on that one.
Well, that sounds like messy.
Yeah, we'll put it in a category. Yeah, it's good.
Yeah, I think that what we're experiencing right now is not so much of a crisis for the church as it is a time of equipping the church. Sooner or later, the doors are going to be open again, but there's been a watershed. Some people that have disconnected. A few of them might never be back. Others, they'll come back as it fits into their life, right? But the other side of it is that there's a core in our churches that are just they're going deeper with God in the midst of all this. They're owning their faith more than when they were, saddled up to our feeding system to keep them going. And so it's a time, I believe, where God is preparing the church for the days ahead, because when things open up, there's a lot of, I think, delayed crisis. And people are going to be in a bigger mess after this is all over, and be struggling and looking for answers. And so that's where I keep putting my focus with our people is, hey, we're affected by what's going on around us for sure, but the real issue is what's God doing in us and how is he preparing us, because we're getting ready.
Can I say too, Wayne, we try to focus a lot on like choose who you lose, right? And so there's an element of, yeah, man, like there's a segment of people who think I'm the devil and I wake up every morning with the desire to ruin people's lives because I'm not having church or I'm not doing whatever, or we're down to the government. And I just kind of have to let people make those choices, right? And so if someone was saying to me, we're just not going to engage with online church, we'll come back. I mean, I would have the pastoral conversation like, well, let's check the heart on that. Like what Kevin was saying, like, this is a time to actually grow in your walk and not abandon. But I'm also not going to, like, we'll keep them on our mailing list and we'll keep them on our porch drop-offs and we'll keep them in community, but I'm not going to let those people have that voice in my life that makes me walk around constantly like I got to chase them. I mean, like that. This is your choice. This is your season. We're all handling the pandemic differently. We're all hurting, and if you're choosing to walk away from church, maybe you'll go to another church, and I'm fine with that, right? But I can't. I got to invest my energy into where there's growth and there's opportunity, and people are hungry, and rather than chasing those that are like, I'm done and I don't want anything to do with it, unless it's a warning sign. But if they keep rejecting me, I gotta walk.
Wait, and you bring up an interesting point, because that as much as we see that with the online versus the in-person, people stopped coming to in-person. Like that was a common occurrence, right? Like people would, I'm every week, and then I'm every other week, and then I'm once a month, and you try to engage them, but sometimes they're just going to another church, or they're, they make those decisions even themselves. And so as much as it's like, you do what you can, but I like what you said. I don't think this may be a controversial statement. I don't think it is, but I don't see the need to chase people. I feel like if people reject and they don't want to be a part of what you're doing, you continue to be invitational, but you're not going to hunt them down. You're not, finding them at the grocery store and, hey, you haven't been to church. I mean, that's never been my philosophy anyway, but yeah, I like what you said there. I do want to respect that, we're coming up on the 2-hour mark, and there's all kinds of questions. And the truth is, I love what I believe it was Nathan who said, like, small groups are a pathway to community. These conversations are really a pathway to community as well. And so you can reach out to any of these pastors as much as you want, and I'm sure they would love to engage in further conversation. I'm not going to advertise your emails, but I know they can get them. But honestly, one of the things I love about all of these guys is they would engage in that conversation if you feel that some of your questions weren't answered. And of course, Cindy and I are here for you as well. That's part of our job, is just engaging and helping pastors in our areas, through what you're dealing with right now. And we're here to help you as best we possibly can. And that's why we do all of this.